Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John. I'm getting ready for work. I've got about an hour before my first online class of the day, and I figured I'd make another video. So the last time I made a video, which was only like maybe 2 or 3 days ago, um, I was talking about a book which was a record of kind of a fantasy journey to what's today Indonesia. Of course, at the time in the 19th century, there was no such thing as Indonesia, so it was, Balzac's fantasy journey from Paris to Java. Today, I want to kind of stick with the same region and, well, the same country, present day country anyway. Although, when I say it's the same country, I might get a little bit of disagreement from some people. Some of the locals might have some things to say about that. Because what we're talking about today is Harvesting the Storm, a fable from the shores of West Papua by John Waromi. This is translated by Sarita Newson. Uh, and as you might have guessed from the subtitle here, this is a novel from West Papua. This is actually the first novel by a West Papuan author to ever be translated into English. So it's a historically important book, if for no other reason than that. And if you don't know the history, essentially West Papua is the western half of the island of New Guinea. Uh, the During the colonial era, New Guinea was divided into three parts. The western half was controlled by the Dutch. The southeastern half was controlled by the British, and the southeastern quarter was controlled by the British, and the northeastern quarter was controlled by the Germans. And after World War One, when the German Empire was forced to give up their colonies, the British took over the northeastern quarter as well, and actually, oddly enough, handed control over it to the Australian government. So even though you could argue that Australia was still a British colony, uh, they had home rule and they had colonies of their own. The Australian New Guinea was essentially an Australian colony. So that's kind of neither here nor there. The reason this is historically important as far as this book goes is that when the colonial era was coming to an end, the eastern half, the British and Australian territories of Papua and New Guinea, um, united to form the modern day independent state of Papua New Guinea. And the western half remained under Dutch control as Netherlands New Guinea. Now, the rest of the islands in the region that were controlled by the Dutch became the present day Republic of Indonesia, and the Indonesian government thought that as the successor state of the Dutch East Indies, Netherlands New Guinea should belong to them as well. However, the Papuan local people were very, very culturally distinct from basically anyone else in Indonesia, and they resisted this idea. So, actually, for several years after Indonesian independence, uh, Netherlands New Guinea remained a Dutch colony, essentially because the local people were resistant to joining Indonesia. And after after that finally happened, after West Papua became part of Indonesia, ever since then there have been periodic uprisings and rebellions and terrorist attacks and things like that against the Indonesian government. And the Indonesian government, for their part, has engaged in a campaign of resettling immigrants from the more densely populated Western islands like Java and Sumatra and Sulawesi to more firmly establish their control over West Papua. And I don't want to get into who's right, who's wrong, because of course it's always complicated. But that's kind of the historical background here. And as a result, there's a lot of kind of hints in this book about the the struggle to kind of maintain a cultural continuity in the face of not just European colonialism, but sort of Indonesian colonialism as well. Uh, but all of that is kind of under the surface because by and large, this book is, as it says, a fable. The main characters are not humans. We do get a glimpse of human life in the villages on shore, but it's all told from the perspective of sea creatures. In particular, there's sort of four main characters. Andevavite is a tide pool blenny. Bohurai is a toadfish. Anggari is a striped crab, and Raukahi is an octopus. And they kind of have their adventures and they deal with the problems of ordinary problems of sea creatures, but also with the problems of a more man-made situation. Because in West Papua, as in a lot of Southeast Asia, um, it's quite common for people to fish using explosives, and in particular, salvaged World War II munitions that have been converted into homemade bombs for the purpose of essentially blowing up the coral reef and harvesting all the fish that float to the top. And this is a social problem for the local people, of course, because it's incredibly dangerous. And the book actually includes at the very end, after the glossary of Ambai words, which Ambai is the local language, and you kind of need it because they do show up quite a bit. It actually does have "In Remembrance of the Bomb Victims, 1970 to 2009," which is a short list of fishermen and others who have died or been wounded as a result of this incredibly dangerous fishing practice. So it's bad for the local people, but it's also incredibly damaging to the environment and the ecosystem. And that's kind of explored a lot in this book, which actually leads me to my first major criticism of the book, which that at times it's a it seems like it can't quite decide whether it wants to be a heavy-handed polemic against this practice and other, damaging environmental practices, or whether it wants to be a lighthearted fable of these sea creatures having adventures. It kind of goes back and forth on this, which I guess you could say that's a positive or a negative thing depending on your perspective, because it does kind of lend the book a sort of a dreamlike quality. You're never quite sure where the book is going. Uh, the stories from chapter to chapter don't quite follow each other. And, as I said, that could be a positive or a negative depending on how you're looking at things. On the one hand, it does take away any kind of through line of plot, but on the other hand, it does establish this kind of almost magical, dreamlike quality to the book that is kind of nice. My other criticism here is I could very well be wrong on this, but I believe it's probably more due to the translation than anything else. Uh, the There's a tendency here to use what I would consider overly specific um, overly specific species names for the animals in the story. As I said, the overwhelming majority of the characters are are sea creatures, and they're sea creatures who behave like humans, but they are still sea creatures, and mostly their names are derived from the local Ambai language, uh, the local names for them. So, for example, Andevavite is just the name of the amphibious tide pool blenny, but almost every time a creature is introduced, it's introduced as, for example, this is Andevavite, the amphibious tide pool blenny, or something like that. And the over, I guess the over specificity of the English names kind of takes you out of the magic of the story. You know, it it feels like it's explaining something that doesn't necessarily need to be explained. And this varies from one place to another. So, for example, I think if you say Bohurai the toadfish or Raukahi the octopus, that's fine. You know, an octopus or a toadfish, they're just kind of general terms that have that same kind of idiomatic quality in English that I'm sure Raukahi or Bohurai have in Ambai. But you know, if you instead talk about, for example, Karapuni, the sharp-nosed wrasse, or Kiku, the black spot sea perch, or Kimiamang, the mangrove fantail, then it gets to it gets to sounding like it's not translated with an ear to language so much as with just a goal of being uh, absolutely technically correct. And I guess there's value to that, especially if anyone is reading this and is curious what these animals actually are, they can look it up. But on the other hand, the book does include a long glossary. So I don't think it's really necessary to include these very, very specific names in the actual text. Um, and and again, I think that kind of goes back to this almost displaced feeling that the book has, where it sometimes seems that it's not quite sure what kind of book it wants to be. Does it want to be a polemic? Does it want to be, uh, you know, an actual fable? Does it want to be a plot-driven novel? Does it want to be a series of short stories? It just goes back and forth. So again, I'm not quite sure if this is a successful book, mostly because I'm not quite sure, even after reading it, uh, what it's trying to be. And so, yeah, I would recommend it mostly because of the historical and cultural importance, because it is, as I said, the first and, as far as I know, the only novel published in English by a West Papuan writer. So there is still value to having it, but yeah, I'm just not sure if it actually succeeds in what it wants to be. Uh, for the record, I mentioned the Ambai language. This book was not actually written in Ambai. It's just the characters and sea creatures are referred to by their Ambai names. It was written in Bahasa Indonesia, which is the official national language of Indonesia. It's a standardized variant of the Malay language, essentially. So the Malay is spoken in Singapore and Brunei, or Bahasa Malaysia is spoken in Malaysia, are um, very, you know, easy to understand between them. They're essentially the same language, just different standardized variants. So this was already written in the author's second language and then translated again into a third language. So when I say it's possibly the translation, I don't necessarily mean to imply anything negative on Sarita Newsom's part. It could very well have been, you know, something that was lost in translation between Ambai and Bahasa Indonesia. Um, but at any rate, it is an interesting story or an interesting book because again, it's not really one story. Each chapter tells a story, and they are loosely connected, and there is a sort of through line to them, but yeah, it kind of gets lost. Uh, but yeah, it's an interesting book. It's certainly fun to read. You know, right up until the forward English specific names for animals takes you out of the story entirely. But still, it's pretty good. I do wish that there was a bit more told from the perspective of the human inhabitants of the region, because the few chapters that are told from that perspective are really interesting. There's one in particular where sort of the village medicine man is visited by an American missionary, and the American missionary speaks to him in his own language, and he's amazed, and he asks him, you know, did you use some kind of magic to do this? And the missionary says, no, I've been talking to your mother, and she taught me. And that's kind of a funny scene. And there's a lot of funny scenes like that in those few human centered chapters. But they're very much the minority, and they don't connect quite as well with the animal-centered chapters as I would have liked either. Still, it's definitely worth reading, if nothing else, just for the interest of having a West Papuan writer in your in your wheelhouse. So I think that's going to be it for today. I recently I've been publishing videos a bit more frequently than when I first started, but I think the next one might be a little bit longer, mostly because the next book I'm reading, and I've already started it, is this one, History of Lana by Saraswati Yongsakul. And it's not particularly long, but it is quite a bit more dense than the books that I've made videos on so far. So I I'm guessing I'll probably get to it in about maybe 5 days, maybe a week. So I will see you then. Have a good afternoon. See you next time.